large government budget deficits, that having large deficits leads to inflation, leads to bad economic outcomes. But number two comes in right away. Williamson wants public expenditure priorities reordered such that subsidies are a less prominent portion of government budgets, that money going to state-owned enterprises are a less prominent portion of government budgets, and that instead governments are spending their money on health, education, and other social welfare programs. So as Williamson conceived it, the Washington Consensus is in favor of social welfare spending, not the way the term is commonly used. He argues for broad and moderate taxation. He argues that government should get out of the business of setting interest rates and that the market should set them. He argues for competitive exchange rates, by which he means essentially that countries should not keep their currencies overvalued because that hinders exporting. He, in fact, I think would endorse China's manipulation of its exchange rate as something that promotes exports and leads to economic growth. So he would put that in the category of competitive exchange rates, even if there's government influence. He's very much in favor of trade liberalization. He's in favor of liberalization of inward foreign direct investments. That is, governments should not restrict foreign investors from investing in companies. Note that he's specific about this. He's in favor of foreign direct investment, which is concrete investment, productive investment in a country. He is not in favor of liberalizing capital accounts broadly. He understands that portfolio investment can be dangerous, as we saw in the late 1990s in East Asia, and therefore does not endorse that in the Washington Consensus as he states it. Privatization generally refers to state-owned enterprises. I'm not clear how he thinks about privatizing utilities. I think there may be issues there. Deregulation, he's concerned about exit and entry from the market for companies. He explicitly says government should continue to regulate safety conditions. They should continue to regulate the environment. That is the business of government. Deregulation under Williamson's Washington Consensus does not include large-scale deregulation. And then he's in favor of property rights. He's in favor of protecting property rights in developing countries. So the idea I want to convey here is, one, that the Washington Consensus, as Williamson conceived it in 1990, is somewhat less intense, somewhat less completely anti-statist, as that term is used in common discourse. When you read about the Washington Consensus, it tends to be a very strong statement about strong neoliberal policies of the type that the Reagan and Thatcher governments were attempting to implement in the US and the UK. Williamson conceived a much more moderate program of reforms that he believed there was true consensus across different stripes of economists in Washington, D.C., and that he believed was actually being implemented in the countries of Latin America. The extent to which structural adjustment programs and other development programs went beyond Williamson's conception, there's debate about that. There's certainly some evidence in favor of that. So the Washington Consensus gets incorporated into structural adjustment lending. It serves as somewhat of a useful summary of the types of reforms that aid agencies were trying to bring about through structural adjustment lending. Did structural adjustment lending accomplish anything? Here's some evidence from William Easterly, his review of the successes and failures of structural adjustment lending. The graph is showing the probability of getting a new structural adjustment loan conditional on having had a certain number of previous structural adjustment loans. So if you had one loan, what was the probability of getting a new loan? About 80%. If you had two loans, what was the probability of getting a new loan? About 80%. If you had three loans, what was the probability of getting a new loan? About 80%. If you had 10 loans, if you had 11 loans, countries never got out of structural adjustment. That's a pretty clear sign that these programs are not accomplishing what they were supposed to accomplish. That you are as likely to get a second structural adjustment loan as you are likely to get the first down the line. Easterly then also looks at whether there's a relationship between the cumulative number of adjustment loans that countries have received and their performance in terms of macroeconomic distortions in countries that have received 7, 8, or 9 adjustment loans had just as many macroeconomic problems as countries that had received 1 or 2. So again, these loans didn't seem to be doing their job. In addition, they created some negative sentiment. There were protests against structural adjustment programs in a number of countries around the world: Bolivia, Nigeria, Ecuador, Sudan, Zambia, Venezuela. The protest in Sudan is pretty amazing. 15,000 people on the streets of Khartoum. In Sudan, where a government that's not so friendly to protests is in power, that 15,000 people come out against the structural adjustment program in Sudan. One of the reasons for these large-scale protests was that the way that structural adjustment was implemented, a disproportionate amount of the costs were borne by marginalized groups, by women, by children, by the poor, and by indigenous people. So by the late 1980s, we have evidence that structural adjustment is not working. We have evidence that it's in fact hurting people within developing countries. The end of the Cold War comes, and it presents a moment to reassess what the development industry should be doing. Should it be continuing on with these Washington Consensus and structural adjustment policies, or should it be changing the way that it works? Should development doctrine change in such a way that development is done in some other fashion? Part of what motivates this need to rethink things is that foreign aid flows start dropping drastically in the early 1990s. They recover in the late 1990s, but for a few years there, the development industry, meaning the people who are making decisions within these development agencies, are going, are we going to have a job tomorrow? It looks like countries are just allocating less foreign aid because the geostrategic motives behind it have disappeared. The end of the Cold War also means that there's a new opportunity to speak out about development issues, to put some new things on the table. And so James Wolfensohn, the new president of the World Bank, famously does this in 1996 with a speech where he talks about the cancer of corruption. So before Wolfensohn speaks out, World Bank staff, World Bank presidents had been fairly reticent about talking about the institutions within the borrowing countries, within developing countries. Wolfensohn opens up the door to that. He opens up the door to what becomes known as the good governance agenda. In the mid-1990s, we also see a huge academic debate about whether foreign aid has done any good. Has it led to economic growth or not? Peter Boone comes out with the first articles in the mid-1990s. He says no. Craig Burnside and David Dollar, who are economists at the World Bank, they say yes, but only in those countries that have good policies as defined by the Washington Consensus and structural adjustment programs. Some other economists responding to Burnside and Dollar, they say no, it works everywhere, just with decreasing marginal returns. Some other folks say, well, some types of aid seem to work and then other types of aid don't seem to work. Bill Easterly and some co-authors responding to Burnside and Dollar, they say no, those guys are wrong, it doesn't work at all. The most believable result comes from David Rudman at the Center for Global Development, who publishes a couple of papers saying we're never going to figure this out, let's give it up. And then some political scientists come to the rescue at the end of the day, David Bierce and Dan Tarone, who say we can find evidence after the Cold War, after strategic motivations for aid giving have gone away or have decreased. That's when aid might be expected to lead to growth. And look, we find some evidence that it does. But the debate goes on, and the point is that there's a huge conversation